the friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac, and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
To get the Crime Writers on Aftershow right now, go to patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On. Crime Writers On is the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, other podcasts. And this week, they walked into a Boston museum and walked out with $500 million in fine art. We'll talk about the Netflix series, This is a Robbery. Plus, after years behind the Audible firewall, West Cork is finally available to those who've never heard of this Irish murder mystery podcast. We'll revisit our 2018 review of this true crime classic. Joining me to get that done and more is my real-life husband and true crime co-author, former TV journalist, host of the These Are Their Stories podcast, love of my life, and popsicle enabler, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
What is this that you were using my table here in the studio, and there's gunk all over it? You've been doing meeting. Look at it's sticky.
I think it's popsicle juice.
You had a popsicle in the studio?
I think I maybe did.
Would you do that at the radio station?
It wouldn't be allowed, but this is my
It's
studio.
not going to be allowed in Studio C anymore.
I never ate a popsicle down here. That's from
This
you.
is the yoga loft above the bodega in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi
New
studio.
Hampshire.
You have to respect it.
Also with us is journalist, true crime author, former defense investigator, licensed private investigator, certified cat lady, and legit certified pet detective, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
Good evening, Rebecca.
Laura, is there anything sticky in your studio tonight?
No, not in my studio.
Oh, thank God.
Thank goodness. Here comes Rocky Flintstone the cat. So,
All right.
Who knows?
Rocky, stay away from that microphone. Finally with us,
That's where the good smells are.
Finally with us, our captain of woke cynicism, the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy, host of the Strange Arrivals podcast about UFOs, and our Patreon book club host, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
So, Toby, did you see the news stories about that whole UFO thing?
Yeah, it's 100% aliens. They finally proved it.
Can you tell the crowd who may not have heard about that other UFO sighting that was immediately identified by the internet? That's my favorite UFO sighting now of all time.
The Batman balloon?
Yes.
You can look it up, but it's what's cool about it is it's a photo that's taken out. Some guy's flying a fighter jet or something, and he took a picture with like an iPhone or something. And it does look like what you'd expect it to look like if you were in a fighter jet and you saw a UFO in the distance. Like, it's just this thing is out there.
Yes, and it's also credible because it's through the windshield of a fighter jet, and you know it was taken by a military person.
It looks like exactly, it'd be like, oh yeah, shit, there's something right there. But then, like, they didn't know what it was, I guess. And they put it up on Twitter, and within like 15 minutes, people were like, "Oh, it's a Mylar balloon." And then like 5 minutes later, they're like, "Oh yeah, it's not just a Mylar balloon; it's this Mylar balloon." And it was a Batman Mylar balloon, which they'd identified. It took them like 20 minutes on Twitter.
The military couldn't figure it out, but the crowd could.
Yeah, but it's an interesting picture. I mean, it is sort of like, when I first saw it, I was like, well, that's the kind of thing that I would expect to see, not like some fuzzy thing in the distance, but it's like this serious object. But it was a Batman balloon.
Why would an Air Force pilot have his iPhone up there?
He's got to keep up with social media.
Yeah.
Stay in touch with the ladies.
Life doesn't stop just because he's up at 40,000 feet or whatever.
I got best fiends.
You know what he's doing? He's reporting Mike Boudet to Twitter safety. Is what he's doing.
God, that guy.
So, quick question, Toby. I just want to clear up for the audience who might not know about your UFO podcast. your take on the podcast is really about skepticism, which is very on brand, right?
Oh yeah. I'm a UFO skeptic, but I think from my perspective, what's kind of interesting is sort of what you can learn from UFO stories. Like, what are they telling us about science or about society or whatever? So I try to like tell UFO stories, but also kind of look at like what's behind them, I guess.
I think we should start a campaign. I think Toby Ball should be the next host of Jeopardy. I'm just going to say it.
Take that, Aaron Rodgers.
I mean, they're not calling LeVar Burton, even though they should. So maybe
they're
they
not
should.
calling LeVar Burton?
Can you fucking believe it? No, even though he should and he wants to. Anyway, it's a whole thing. Should we go ahead and start this podcast now? All right, let's get it done. Leading off.
I mean, everybody talks about the gardener. This is it. The biggest art theft in the history of the world. Millions of dollars worth of artwork. They disappeared. Somebody had to know something.
In March of 1990, two men dressed as Boston police officers entered the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, tied up the guards, and made off with $500 million worth of fine art, including works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Manet, and Degas.
Cuffed my partner, very dramatically said, "Gentlemen, this is a robbery."
Was the heist an inside job? The work of a master art thief from Massachusetts? The IRA or the Italian mafia? And what happened to those famous paintings sliced right from their frames?
We started getting calls from South America.
We had this lead that came from Japan.
There was a tip that said the paintings had been stolen by a group and they had wound up in France.
Netflix's 4-part series, This is a Robbery, takes an in-depth look at how the heist went down, the many colorful characters who could have pulled it off, and the likelihood these masterpieces will ever be recovered. Spoiler alert, we are going to be talking about plot points from This is a Robbery, so if you want to remain spoiler-free, go to the estimated time code in our show notes for our thumbs up or thumbs down review. Laura Bricker, you've been to the Gardner Museum, right?
Yeah, so every time something comes up about this, I think this was my junior high field trip. The first time, pretty much, I left the state of Vermont and went to Boston, and we went to the Gardner Museum.
Were you scoping the place out? You casing it?
Yeah, because it was, the time frame was right, Kevin. It was like 88, 89 would have been, or maybe 87, 88, 80, like in that era would have been when I was there. And I don't really remember so much about the museum. I remember it was also my first trip to a mall, like the Burlington Mall on the way home.
Fancy.
So that was like actually the highlight of the trip. But
I do remember day.
It was a big day for me.
That is definitely the fanciest mall in our region. It's where Mall Cop was filmed, right, Kevin?
Yeah, actually it was. Yeah. It's true, yes.
And there's a Crate and Barrel there, which is very fancy. Now, Kevin, what about the format of this documentary? Because we've reviewed a bunch of documentaries in the last few months, a lot of them like largely made during the pandemic. I thought this one was really well put together. What did you think?
Oh, I thought so too. And by the way, I just, having read something, I mean, they've been shooting this for about 4 years now, so it's not all pandemic production. But I did think it was put together very well. Certainly the first episode where we get to find out about the art and the museum and that background and give us an appreciation for what the heist was about. I thought that was very well done. And, you know, there's just enough sort of Boston flavor to it without being too much. It doesn't become this sort of Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Boston noir.
I like them apples.
Yeah, you know, they got to go. Becomes a cliche. You know, got to meet you in Mattapan, up in Saugus. Come meet me in Peabody. It wasn't. It wasn't
like a Dennis Lehane movie.
Yeah, it wasn't like that. You know, they had all these bagpipes and shit like that. You know, it caught a lot of sort of the flavor of that museum, because I think you have to care about the art in order to care about the heist. Otherwise, it's just, you know, the MacGuffin Museum, right? You want to know a little more. You want to, like, really care about or know why, you know, Christ on the Sea of Galilee is a big deal.
Yeah,
right?
It is a big deal. It's big. It's
big.
the only one like it by Rembrandt.
Like it's a $10 million painting.
Yeah,
right?
and it's like 4x5, which means you could not put it in a tiny Tupperware under your shed, as we discover in the documentary. Now, Toby, one of the things that's always fascinated me about this robbery, which is for us like a regionally famous story, but it is, you know, I think there have been a lot of pop culture references to it, is the guard, Rick Abath, who looks like he wants to be Howard Stern, first of all. Second, when you see the pictures of him tied up with duct tape all over his face and hair, to me, it looks like the way you would put duct tape on yourself if you were trying to like duct tape.
The guy who was dealing with me was taller and skinny. He was wearing these gold-framed, like, round glasses, if I remember correctly, and he had a mustache. It looked really greasy. It was probably a fake mustache.
What do you think of the whole Rick Abath thing? He definitely kind of emerges as somebody who might have been involved, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, if I had hair like that, I wouldn't want duct tape anywhere near it.
Ouch, yeah.
Seems like it's going to be a freaking nightmare. So this is like one of my main criticisms of this is that they do kind of make this case that it seems like he might be involved in some way, but then they don't tie it to the rest of their sort of theory about what happened. It's like, well, it's pretty weird that he was opening the door and that, you know, he wasn't like super tied up and maybe he was involved, right? And then they later go, and I assume we'll talk about this in a minute, with this sort of bigger, more definitive theory that they kind of put forward, but they don't connect the two at all, unless I'm forgetting something. But there's no point at which those two things kind of meet.
Ooh, there is, though. It was basically just a throwaway thing where it was like they paid him a few $100 and like it was easy to do because everybody who worked there, like, it wasn't a professional job. It was just like a side gig. That was the only time they
that's not really a connection. I mean, that's just like, in my mind, that's just like, theory. Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of like, well, you know, maybe they toss him a couple $100. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It was interesting where they had that tape from their dinner table talk with that reporter. So yeah, I mean, it was good, but it just kind of got dropped. And then, you know, I just kind of felt the whole thing was didn't cohere very well. I thought there were parts of it, like the different parts were fairly good, but did they create a very good whole? That's what I'm not sure about.
So you got this guy, Rick Abath, is that his name? Yeah. And he's got the big, like, head of curly hair.
The 80s Howard Stern do, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, like, I know you shouldn't judge people by the way they look, but this museum hired a guy with Howard Stern hair and a fanny pack.
Yeah.
And they said, this is the guy to guard priceless works of art.
Yes.
You get what you pay for.
Well, that was the whole point.
Tie-dye under his uniform?
I mean, the whole point.
Isn't he going there just to like play the trombone at night or something? I forget.
Well, Anne Hawley, who is the museum director who was brought in like right before the crime happened, she kind of came in and like was ship-shaping the place, right? There was just a lot of like infrastructure stuff to do. Mm-hmm. They talked about how the Isabella Stewart Gardner, there should be clouds inside the museum because the HVAC situation sucked so bad. Like there's these priceless works of art and it was just like dinge and like bad, you know, air everywhere. Anyway, it seems like part of that kind of poor infrastructure was just kind of a lax take on, you know, it was probably like a $10 an hour job or whatever the equivalent was then. And they were just hiring people and they thought it was all together, but they had bigger things to focus on. Like the fact that these art was going to be ruined by having literal clouds inside the museum. That was my takeaway. Laura, question for you. One of the things I found so interesting about this is the fact that stealing art is not necessarily about hanging the art in your secret rich person house or selling the art in the black market, but art as blackmail, art as a tool to lessen your jail sentence, art as a trade with the cops over something, and that being a motivating factor for like a ton of art thefts. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things when I'm thinking about this case and the fact that this art has never resurfaced and there's all these rumors of where it is, but there's never actually been any like verified sightings. So, you know, when you think about that and then you hear the story in this case where it was like, well, this guy was in jail and he was like the son to this mafia boss. And this is, you know, something he was going to use as a bargaining chip. What was interesting about that is there's this sort of like, it doesn't jive with when I think of like mobsters. I don't think of Rembrandt. So, you know, the fact that they were carrying off a pretty sophisticated heist and knowing which artwork to take that was most valuable, you know, that was really interesting. But it's also just kind of sad because then in the long run, this artwork never does make it out to be seen again and appreciated, which is what you would hope it would be used for.
Well, you would or you wouldn't, because the idea for me of like a Rembrandt just being in somebody's like secret collection where only they can see it. Like I find that very depressing in a way, but also I find it like very depraved. Like there is this whole like, as we've been learning in the last few years, this like ultra 1% part of the world where not only do they live in a crazy way, but they do like insane things. Like nothing is ever enough. I could imagine, for instance, Jeffrey Epstein having one of these fucking Rembrandts in his like weird like molestation palace. I honestly could. Like in that, I don't know. I don't know. I kind of like the idea better that these guys are just like, listen, I may be arrested for a future thing. So one thing I can do is steal this Picasso.
Right.
Because that will help lower my sentence in a year when I'm going to be arrested for this other shit that I did.
Well, it's weird because it seems like it's the only crime where the thing that's taken is more valuable than the criminals.
Yeah.
Right? No one ever says, you robbed the bank, give us the money back,
Yes.
right? They're not, that isn't the thing they're trying to do. And one of the things that they don't really talk about is that the statute of limitations on this crime has lapsed.
Yeah.
The federal statute of limitations is 5 years. So unless, you'd throw in some sort of conspiracy thing or furtherance of a conspiracy, the people who did it could come forward and return the art. Or at least if you knew something, you could say it without at least getting in trouble with the law. I mean, you might get in trouble with the mafia or somebody, but
it seems like there's a bunch of murders that are sort of connected.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could probably say, hey man, that's outside of the scope of what I was doing. I just stole some paintings, but it's one of those things. They're one of a kind things. So you either get them back or you don't. There's not like, I'll just get another Rembrandt and stick it in that same spot. It's not the way it works.
Yeah. Well, there's this great line. Dennis Leary is in the Thomas Crown affair. He's the cop, and Rene Russo is the insurance investigation. And then, of course, Pierce Brosnan is Thomas Crown. By the way, that 90s version of Thomas Crown affair is a perfect 10 movie if you haven't seen it.
That's like your favorite, anyway.
It's one of my favorite movies. But there's a great line about like the import of paintings as commodities. And Dennis Leary basically says, like, only a very few rich people care this much about this thing. But it's true. And the influence of that, and of course, the fact that it's one of a kind and of historical import, it's very interesting to me that it has that much weight as opposed to, say, killing somebody. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But going into this documentary, you definitely would think, well, why would you, if you couldn't fence it, why would you want the art? What value does it have? And then they bring in the receipts. They talk about Miles Connor.
Oh, my God. We got to talk about him.
And how he used recovered art to get his sentence reduced.
Do you guys remember that podcast we listened to about Murph the Surf? And we're sort of like,
The Sneak.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Miles Connor is the real fucking deal.
And some people consider me the biggest art thief in this country because I've robbed a number of museums. But then again, I was a rock and roll guy.
So I interviewed the director of this documentary. He told me that Miles Connor, like the legend of Murph the Surf, had all of these other things that happened in his life besides just being an art thief. But to me, it's incredible that somebody who was like an admitted genius art thief is just sitting down doing interviews for a documentary. Laura, what did you think about that?
Well, I thought he was a great character because, you have him kind of sitting outside. He's kind of a little bit of this like kooky character. He's obviously very forthcoming about what he was doing, and he's pretty proud of what he did. But he was just kind of like, I think if I was out and about and I ran into him, I would want to sit and talk to him to hear all of his crazy stories, even though I think half of them would be total bullshit because he likes to talk about things that may or not be true. No, he was the one that did the other museum, correct? The one that was, So it's like a whole new underworld that I didn't know. I mean, I knew existed, but it's interesting to see it right here in our very own backyard.
Toby, what'd you think of Miles Connor?
He's a great character. I think he's 75% full of shit. But that's fine. In the context of this documentary, that's absolutely fine. The 25% is probably worthwhile. In the end, does he really have anything to do with this heist? I don't think so. So he's in there for like, he's kind of a red herring. He kind of gives you a little background. He gives you a crap load of color, but that's about it, right? I mean, they kind of follow this dead end where he supposedly stashes those paintings that in the trailer of some low-level crook who then takes this journalist from the Boston Herald on a drive from Boston to New York to show him for like 30 seconds a picture by flashlight in a factory in Red Hook.
And he's kind of running the light over it a little bit. Eventually, like the beam hits the Rembrandt signature. And then he says, okay, that's all. We got to go. There's my proof.
There are these like weird little blind alleys that you go down and you kind of realize that they're probably not going to pay out because you're only on part 2 of a 4-part thing. So it's like, is this really going to be the solution? Anyway, but he's a good character. I would like to just see a documentary about him, quite
Same.
honestly.
And I would recommend, Toby, that you look him up because the stuff you think is 75% bullshit is not. I did that. I was completely amazed.
Really?
Yeah. Kevin, what did you think about this guy?
I think he could have picked a different shirt. So let's go.
It's moisture wicking, dude.
I'm like, he could have cut the grass. And like, here, let's set up a chair right in the middle.
He didn't give a fuck. I love that.
He didn't give a fuck. I'm in my slippers and my clean white T-shirt, and apparently I have a non-climate controlled storage bunker in my backyard where I kept stolen artwork before. We know that he was imprisoned at the time of the heist, but these 2 fake cops, these 2 robbers, went through like they had a shopping list. So we have to assume that they knew what to take because somebody had to tell them what to take. And certainly some of the ideas about what the security systems are going to be like, some of it definitely could have been from some drunk blabbermouth, $5 an hour security guard, but also, somebody who knew how to pull off an art heist would have to be consulted, right?
Yeah. Were you curious about why they stole that little tiny vase? Because I actually have the answer to that.
No, I was curious.
When I interviewed the director, I asked him that question. It's not really explained. Apparently, there was another robbery where one of those tiny little vases was stolen. It was worth like a gajillion dollars. Mm-hmm. So, like a lot of people think that they were sent in for the paintings, or they went for the paintings, but then someone just walked by that thing and like, oh, that's like that thing that. So and you could just put it in their pocket. The same with that little weird corbel thing. Like it was just small, and it was something similar to something else that had been worth a lot.
It could have been a jackpot thing.
Exactly. It was
the weird thing. I mean,
it was the scratch ticket of things to sell.
The security system, where like even for like 1990, that would like buzz when proximity alerts when people would go through something. The one thing that was really interesting was in the Blue Room, which is one that the system says that the burglars didn't go to. While they were there, it did go off before they showed up. So it certainly does kind of like make you think, did somebody on the inside...
Was it Rick putting that vase in his pocket?
Yeah.
Before he taped his Howard
I think
Stern
it was the
little
Monsieur Shay, whatever the thing was. Yeah, little...
We're very artsy here. Tell me what you're going to say.
I think some guy with like half an hour in a library could figure out what was the valuable stuff in there.
Or the pamphlet from the tour. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like when they're like, it must have had, somebody must have directed them. It's like, I feel like if you got the pamphlet from the tour and went to the Boston Public Library and spent a few hours just doing a little research, you could probably figure out a lot of it. And then the fact that they were just like cutting these things out of the frames, they weren't doing anything to preserve them in any kind of way. I mean, they're treating them very roughly. So I wasn't totally convinced that somebody was kind of telling them much of anything. I mean, it seemed like you could just like wait for this fucking burnout guy walk out as a guard and be like, hey man, you want to make $200? Just let us in on this day. And he's like, okay.
Yeah.
And then you just do it that day. And you're like, I'm going to take these paintings. I'm going to take off and I'm going to do whatever. I mean, I guess that's the thing. It's like what happened once they left and where did it go? And you're kind of given this sort of theory without a ton of evidence as far as I could tell.
So does that make this the perfect crime or a perfect crime?
I feel like it's more of a perfect crime when you get something out of it other than a bunch of paintings stuck in a warehouse somewhere.
Or under someone's shed.
But as far as if it's just like, can you get away with something that's super high profile? Like, I would feel pretty good about myself, I think.
Laura, so there is this whole, the documentary goes through a series of theories, but the one that they kind of land on is mafia related. And there's a journalist who kind of gets hooked into this story and ends up going on like the mafia tour of New England. I'm just curious about that twist, because I do remember the news story about like, we are searching this home in Connecticut and we're digging underneath this shed and we found this giant empty Tupperware. Like, what did you think of that part of the story?
Well, I loved all the journalists. You know, back in Boston, we have these like gritty, seasoned Boston Globe reporters that have been doing this forever. The one, Shelley Murphy, who's covered organized crime forever, it seems like. But my favorite, I want to talk about this guy because I loved him. The guy from the Hartford Courant, the reporter. I felt like his description, like at first you see him and he's like this like clean-cut older man. But once he starts describing this scene with, and I can't remember the name of the guy in New Jersey. It's the old guy who went to Maine to the Lobster Pound and picked up the
Robert
paint.
Gentile.
And all these guys have this like car business. And then you see this like shitty used car business. I'm like, oh my God, I know those places. But I loved how like he installed the gourmet kitchen in the back and was like cooking for all the like washed up retired gangsters.
Making the gravy.
Yeah.
Every morning.
It was like in Goodfellas when they were like making the gravy in jail with the slicing the garlic with the razor.
But it just, I don't know about you guys, that gave me such a good visual. I was like, oh my God, I can totally imagine this scene.
You got another prison on the 17th, which I think was a Saturday. I had lunch with him. I paid. He bought 2 lunches. Took one home with him.
Can we just talk about sort of the seminal theory of this, the final theory? So I guess it's not the seminal theory.
Who said seminal?
About David Turner, who is like the one living guy who was part of this gang, who, by the way, just looking at his face, David Turner, if you're listening to this, turn this off now because I'm very scared of you. Looks like the scariest motherfucker I have ever seen.
Yeah, he looks like, too jolly.
He looks like he would be played by that guy who looks like Matt Damon that isn't Matt Damon, who was in Breaking Bad. You know that guy? Like that guy would play David Turner. Like he looks terrifying to me, and it sort of lands on him.
Put a fake mustache and police hat on him and draw his face.
He looks just like the picture.
Just saying.
So, Toby, what do you think of this sort of, you said you sort of feel like it doesn't prove it, but I do feel like the David Turner and all the other guys being dead thing, like he's out and maybe connected. Like, what did you think of that whole conclusion that they kind of led us to here?
You know, my sense at the end of it, without like going back and watching it again to test my theory, is that all that shit could have happened and had the paintings didn't have to be involved at all. They could have just been involved in something else. Like they're crooks, right? And then they eventually just crossed each other and some died natural deaths or OD'd or whatever.
Or were rubbed out and like thrown in a trunk.
I didn't see, and maybe I missed something, but there was no point I was like, okay, well, there it is. You know, they had the paintings. They must have. Instead, it's like all this shit happened and now he's out and maybe he knows where the paintings are. They kind of have this theory, but then is there ever evidence other than people like kind of telling stories?
Kevin, the IRA is at one point implicated too, right?
Oh, yeah. I love that the IRA had a press officer who's still around. It's like, it's rubbish. It's garbage. We wouldn't have any of that. Take your art. Go back to Methuen.
13 paintings would have been the last thing that they would even bring up at an army council meeting. What are we talking about this shit for? Really nothing to do with this.
But that's been your job, right? It's to like write press releases for things that are happening. Like what kind of press releases would the IRA write? It would be like...
It'd be like, we take credit for that pipe bomb you found at the train station.
Right.
Yeah.
For more information, call.
Well, I think we should do what we do. Let's let our listeners know, should they check out This Is a Robbery on Netflix? It's a 4-part documentary about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist and all of the theories around it. Laura Bricker, what do you think? Thumbs up or thumbs down for This Is a Robbery?
So I'm going to do a thumbs up for this. It's not like a huge thumbs up, but anytime we have something that happens in our own backyard where it's in our region, obviously we've all followed this case for years. Heck, I was there casing the joint. It could have been me. It could be in my basement right now. Just kidding. My only thing with this is I feel like it did get very dense at times. There was some really into the weeds play-by-play of all of the investigation and the players. And it sometimes, for me, that sort of slowed the momentum of the story. But if you want to know about this heist and you want to know everything that happened behind the scenes, this is totally the documentary to watch.
Toby, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for This Is a Robbery?
Kind of giving it an thumbs up. Like I feel like now, like people know how to make a quality true crime documentary. I think that the formula is there and you can kind of find your crime and find the right people to talk to and plug them in. And it's good to have a colorful person and just a couple of cops and some newspaper people. It's certainly an interesting case. There's some interesting sort of storylines, but at the end of it, it kind of felt, and maybe this is an accurate representation of the effort to find these things, is that it was just kind of casting about and sort of came up with what they seemed like was the most plausible thing. But again, I mean, I didn't walk away convinced that that was what had happened, that it had been like this mob thing and they'd gone up to Maine and then Hartford and then Philadelphia and all this stuff. I mean, that just seemed like another possibility, but without much proof. So it's a low pass in my book.
Still a thumbs up, though. What about you, Kevin?
I'm going to go thumbs up. I agree that, it's good. It's not great. The problem with the source material, of course, is that there's no resolution. We don't know what happened to the paintings. Nobody was ever arrested. And so when you're telling the story, when you're thinking about, well, what's the ending going to be? I mean, the whole thing could kind of fall apart. And it doesn't really fall apart, but I think that they're able to tell a good enough story along so that you're like, even though the ending is not really a satisfying ending, that you could still kind of go, okay, but that was a really interesting story. So in any event, it was an interesting case. There have been a couple of podcasts about it, several documentaries. This is a good one, and it if you want to, enter this crime and find out what it's all about, see all the videotape from inside, check out the guy's curly hair, watch this.
Yeah, I like this documentary too. I'm going to give it a thumbs up. I think my favorite part about it was more about the museum itself. I mean, so many stories about this that have been told really focus on the theft, the sort of like heist part of it. But here we get a lot of actually about the museum. I really think Anne Hawley is like a fascinating character in this. She was like new on the job, and then this happens and she becomes the face of like the biggest art crime in history. There was stuff like that I found really interesting. The one thing I will say is that every piece of media that's ever been made about this, the two podcasts, both of which I did not enjoy that I listened to about this, they all sort of seem like they're all trying to solve it. And I think at this point we know that like you're not going to solve it. Like either someone's going to like buy something at the Salvation Army that's going to turn out to be one of these Rembrandt paintings, or find it in someone's basement after their grandma dies, or it's never going to be solved. Like I think the paintings, some of them have probably been destroyed at this point, whatever. I would really have loved it if going into it, it was more like why this can't be solved. You know what I mean? Because there is some of that in there, but that's not the frame around. I think about In the Dark season one.
Frame.
No, but I think about In the Dark season 1, right? They got this huge break where the Jacob Wetterling case was solved like 3 weeks before the podcast came out. Mm-hmm. But the podcast was supposed to be about why this wasn't solved. And I actually love that take. And I think this story should have been approached with that take. Why isn't it solved? Because there's this, and this. Other than that, I really love the documentary. I think it's really nicely put together. Thumbs up for me for This Is a Robbery.
Do you ever meet someone who seems kind of off? Whether it's a creepy neighbor or random phone number that keeps calling you, Truthfinder has you covered. You can search for people by name, address, phone number, email, and more. Truthfinder can be especially helpful for running confidential background checks on anyone you're planning to meet from online dating apps. Go to truthfinder.com/podcasts for a special offer. That's truthfinder.com/podcasts to access your special offer today.
The friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite like 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac, and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
Kevin Flynn, here we are in the business section.
Ba-da-ba-da.
Ba-da-ba-da. So what have you got to talk about, Kevin? What is happening in our Patreon right now?
Hey, we're closing in on 200 podcasts.
In our Patreon?
In our Patreon.
That's almost as many as are outside our Patreon.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of great stuff. Like, it's easy to get in on Patreon. You go to patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. And at the $5 level, you get things like the Crime Writers on After Show. On this week's After Show, which is in that feed right now, We're going to be talking about the latest filing from Kathleen Zellner.
In the Stephen Avery case.
In the Stephen Avery case.
For making a murderer.
She got herself an alternative suspect, so we're going to talk about that.
What jacket is she wearing? That's what's the most important.
Yeah, look, you can get that at the $5 level. At the $6 level, you also get Leave It to Bricker. And in the latest episode, we hear Laura and fireman Ken talking. And Laura, someone asked whether we think that Ken sounds like Ray Romano.
Oh,
yeah, he does.
I don't know.
Like a Massachusetts version of Ray Romano instead of like a New York version of Ray Romano. Yeah, he has a little nasally thing. I can see that.
Yeah.
He's cuter, though. A lot cuter.
Well, there you go. And and I'll have a new Leave It to Bricker coming out soon, a follow-up to that one, part 2. So stay tuned. We've got some great Crime Writers On listeners around the world that are also volunteering at vaccine clinics.
Nice.
And we're going to hear from them.
Nice.
You also can get Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast. And this time, or I should say, coming up soon, the next month, the book is Hidden Valley Road.
Salad dressing?
No, Hidden Valley Road.
Oh.
Hidden Valley Ranch is delicious, but Hidden Valley Road by Bob Kolker.
One of our favorite writers.
Toby, who are the guests coming?
So I apparently lost the ability to count to 3 because I have 4 guests, which is the most guests we've ever had. But it's going to be an awesome panel, as you're about to hear.
It's going to be an extra long episode.
Yes. It's Crime Beat host and journalist, formerly with the Orange County Register, now with the Nashville Tennessean, I believe, Keith Sharon. Mm-hmm. We have Dr. Scott from LA Not So Confidential.
Nice.
For people who don't know, Hidden Valley Road is about it's about a family with 12 kids, 6 of whom were schizophrenic, and about their story, but then also how that family kind of provided some of the keys to what we know about schizophrenia. Anyway, so Dr. Scott, who is a forensic psychologist, should have some insight. Nanita Cranford.
Nice. One of our favorite listeners.
And somebody named Rabia Chaudhry.
Nice.
So that's
Rabia
the group
Chaudhry.
and me.
Nice.
And Toby. Now, they're recording that on April 28th. That audio podcast will be out shortly after, but if you're at the $25 level at Patreon, you also can watch them record the podcast, and you can take part either by chat or even coming on in the video and then getting in on the podcast and taking part in the book club with your own thoughts.
It's going to be like a Zoom situation.
This time because Toby overbooked it.
Yeah, it can't be Crowdcast.
Can't be Crowdcast. It'll be on Zoom, but we'll make it work for everybody.
It'll be fine.
Yeah.
You just record the Zoom. It'll be fine. It'll be totally fine.
And whether you're on Patreon or not, we want you to sign up for our newsletter.
You have to. It's so good.
Like, it's very easy. You just go to crimewriterson.com. Right at the top of the page there, just put in your email address. You'll get... on Monday mornings, you'll get an update about what's in the episode. You'll get to see the cat of the week. You'll get sneak peeks on what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks. Plus, you're going to get CWO BTS. That's behind the scenes. It's not a dance group.
It's a K-pop group.
It's a K-pop group.
But you actually get the behind the scenes as well. Kevin, I got to tell you, you're crushing the newsletter. I'm loving the newsletter.
Thank you, babe.
I am on the show, and I love reading the newsletter about the show I am on. That's saying something about the quality of our newsletter. Congratulations.
Same. I love the newsletter as well. I especially love when I write a note to the listeners in the newsletter.
Ooh.
I also like these little tidbits that show up. I'm like, I didn't know that.
Neither did I. And I was there.
Yeah.
So go to crimewriterson.com, sign up for our newsletter. Kevin, before we leave the business section, do we have any Patreon patron saints of the week this week?
Our Patreon patron saints are Claire Guyton and Tom Ring. Bless you.
Bless you. And thus ends the business section. Back in 2018, Audible released the podcast West Cork. For a brief period, it was free to listen to on the Audible app, but then it went behind a paywall. Despite the praise for the show, many true crime fans never got a chance to listen to this instant classic. Well, now is your chance. Audible has released West Cork on the major podcast platforms where it will remain for public consumption for the next 12 months. So now we get to do something we've never had the chance to do before. Replay a review for a podcast many of you were unable to hear the first time around. So let's rewind the tape and play our first spoiler-free review of West Cork. Audible this week released its 13-part true crime series, West Cork.
'Twas a beautiful, still night. Frosty, full moonish, and calm. There were stories all over the place about people heard her screaming, and maybe they did, you know. But she was found the next morning, battered to death on the road.
Though the murder of a French national in a sleepy Irish village is familiar to many people in Ireland, England, and France, it's a virtually unknown case to American audiences. A husband and wife team spent 3 years in and reporting around West Cork, documenting a story about small-town rumors, botched investigations, spies, and double agents, with the prime suspect still living among his community members. If you've never heard of this case, do not look it up before you listen.
Don't Google it. Yeah.
Don't do it. Don't do it. I didn't do it, and it's a decision that I stand by, and I always look at spoilers. We plan to keep our discussion as spoiler-free as we possibly can because we want you to be able to listen to the podcast and enjoy its many surprises as much as I just want to say I did. I can't speak for the rest of you. We'll talk about basic plot points. We'll never refer to the suspect by name, and other characters will also say the characters who they are, but not their names. So if you still want just a strict thumbs up or thumbs down review of West Cork to know if it's worth your time, we will put the timestamp in the show notes as to when we're doing that part. But
stick around.
Stick around.
Yeah, you're not
We're going to try
spoiled.
to keep this spoiler free. Yeah. You can know up front that the victim, because they say it right up front, is Sophie Toscan du Plantier, a French documentarian who was killed just before Christmas 1996 in West Cork. We also know that the nation of Ireland knows who the prime suspect is and that he's a bit of a celebrity, but the suspect's identity is held back from listeners for several episodes. Kevin, was it a good idea to do it this way?
Yeah, I think so. His identity is known to people who have followed this in the UK and Ireland and whatnot. But to most of us, this is brand new. I think that this was a clever narrative device because it draws you into sort of a large cast of characters. And to some extent, when we find out who this suspect is, we're a little taken aback.
Because we already know the suspect.
Because we've met this person.
That's right. Toby, what do you think? Did this work to hold back the identity of the suspect for so long at the start of West Cork?
Yeah, definitely. And I think for the reasons Kevin mentions, and I also think because this person has such a strong and unique personality that I think it would risk taking over if this person was introduced earlier in the show. So I think being able to kind of set up the situation without having the prime suspect be sort of identified and taken a look at, I think was definitely the right choice.
That's a really good point because the prime suspect doesn't hijack the podcast, but a lot of content has to be about the suspect, for many reasons, which become evident. Laura, the structure of the podcast, did it work for you?
It did. It was definitely, I also tried not to Google this before I started. And the way that it was told, it was revealing things almost like a book in terms of, little bits of information being doled out so that you didn't get all the information up front. And you were I felt like I was learning information as it was happening kind of chronologically in the case, which made it more satisfying and also more outrageous. And I just became upset at certain things when they were revealed. I was like, I can't believe that. There was definitely some crazy things that occurred in this case. So it did work for me. There were a couple points where I felt like it did get a little bit slow in the actual buildup. But if you can get through that when the big reveal comes and the pace starts to pick up, it's all worth it.
It's interesting that you should say that because I think it's tempting to think of this as a European podcast because the two hosts are British. It's not. This is an American podcast produced by an American company with American editors and American producers. They're all in the credits. It's all the folks at Audible, some of whom I know, by the way, I'm friends with on Facebook.
Eric Newsom.
Yet, Kevin, don't you think this podcast feels a little more structured like not an American sensibility?
Yeah, sort of a pacing kind of is very steady. And I don't want to say slow, but it's not action-packed, right? Mm-hmm. And there's sort of a lot of interviews and they're setting up an awful lot for later on. So if you're looking for, bam, something right off in the first episode, you might be disappointed. I'm glad that we got to listen to all of it, beforehand. If we only listen to like 2 episodes, like sometimes we get to do.
Thanks to our friends at Audible for making the episodes available to us. That was a big difference.
I think we would have been left with a very different impression of what this podcast was about and where it was going. So, but to me, it actually feels more like a book, and Laura said this, but when I look at the way that the episodes are structured, they're very much structured like a true crime, like chapters in a true crime book.
Right.
In the sense that we have one which is right up front, which is dedicated to the victim, one that's dedicated to the crime scene.
The place.
One that is dedicated to the place, which is where they lead off with. That's the first one. You don't usually do that in a book, but you could. And then like sort of one that's, looks specifically at the background of the prime suspect. And then you get into sorts of all other things, but each has deep dives, but each has a theme,
right?
Which I think it's kind of like, whoa, this is an Audible production. I don't know if that's by intention or not, but it did sort of have the feel to me of something like a book.
No, I totally agree. It's like an Ann Cleeves book, this podcast.
Oh, okay.
It's very much like the pace and the structure of a British mystery novel, where there are sections, and very often in some of the books that I listen to, there are sections that are divided into sub-chapters, and each one of those sections is about a thematic story or side story or a piece of the story. And that's how it felt to me. Now Toby, talking about place, because West Cork, has a very specific set of people living there, and it's in a very specific geography, and the show does spend an awful lot of time up at the top describing the place, something we've heard before. I think season 2 of Accused did something similar, where they felt that there was a need for you to understand the environs. What did you think of that way to kick off this show, to go do this lengthy description of the place and the people there?
Well, first of all, it sounds awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would definitely like to spend a year there.
It is. I've actually been to Crookhaven in West Cork,
all right. Well,
and it is awesome.
I want to hear about that after Toby's answer.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's both. It's good and it's important because it isn't like a traditional place, right? I mean, it's a place where, it's fairly remote and it attracts artists and creative types. Yeah, what they call blow-ins.
Yeah, it's a good term.
And so there's a lot of people who aren't from around there originally. For this story, I think it's actually pretty critical to kind of understand all that stuff, because it does sort of set up some of the dynamics and tensions that come into play as the story kind of moves along.
Now, Laura, one of the things that I think makes this podcast stand apart is the amount of access they have to the suspect.
Yes.
Is it the most access we've heard to a suspect in a case since Serial season 1, you think?
I think so. I mean, I'm sure, somebody will correct me if there was something that I missed, but it was definitely not only access, but just the amount of research and information that the suspect had on hand to provide the husband and wife team, the level of involvement in the story, which is good and bad, because I feel like, part of what hits me about this suspect is that he has an ability to sort of almost like hijack situations to deflect from what's really happening onto what he thinks you should be paying attention to. And I feel like that might be sort of like almost like the trap here in having as much access as they do.
Now, Toby, we have a husband and wife, Sam and Jennifer, working on this podcast.
Lame.
As a team. I actually love it. Shut up, Kevin. And I think that, as Laura was saying, they do have this unprecedented access to this suspect, this guy who they show has the ability to take over and hijack, and they tell us, try to do that to them. Do you think they do a good job staying objective, keeping their distance from the traps that this guy is trying to lay for them potentially?
Yeah. It's not like an exact one-to-one thing, but he did remind me a little bit of John McLemore in that he's a big personality, definitely manipulative. In the case of this suspect, I think believes that the more chance he gets to explain himself and try and drive the narrative, the better off he is. I don't think that's necessarily true, but in his mind, clearly that is the case. And this is one of the things I really liked about this podcast. It starts off as being like sort of a super competent but fairly conventional true crime podcast. And then it just becomes these different things as well. And part of it is this character study of the prime suspect, who, at least to me, I found him super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's not particularly likable, but he does have this kind of charisma about him. He does seem like the kind of guy you'd sit at next to a pub, and then he would talk for like 4 consecutive hours about stuff that some of which you might be interested in, some of which you wouldn't. I think they actually do an excellent job of letting them talk.
Yep.
You know, and you have enough of a framework through which to kind of understand what he's talking about that you're able to kind of, you know, I think sort of come to your own conclusions without sort of being led by the hand to them, which I think is difficult to do, and I think they do it really well.
Can we go back for a second and talk about place?
Sure.
In the town of West Cork is not a town. That's
the county.
The county.
Cork is a county.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool, and Toby was talking about blow-ins, and so I think they kind of explained, like, it's sort of the farthest west in Europe that you can go.
Yep.
It is sort of, you know, metaphorically the end of the earth.
Yep.
It's secluded.
It's secluded. There are palm trees there, which they don't mention in the podcast, but it's super weird because it never freezes there. So like because it's right on the current that comes up from the Gulf of Mexico across the Atlantic. It's sort of, even though the water is very cold, like you don't necessarily want to jump into the ocean, but randomly freezes so seldom there that there are occasionally palm trees that pop up. It's a very interesting place. It is a gorgeous place. When I was a teenager, I spent a month there with my family. My parents rented a house in Crookhaven. And so when they talk about O'Sullivan's Pub in Crookhaven, I'm like, oh, snap. That is the first place I ever drank.
And spoiler alert, the 80-year-old pub owner is not the prime suspect.
No.
But I think, and I want to ask you guys if you feel the same way, I think the Irish are just so expressive.
Biased.
And, well, okay. All right, but okay, I'm American. Family comes from Ireland, but I just think when you listen to them, everybody speak, it's just not only just so charming, the turn of phrase, which I think is probably just, you know, natural idioms that they throw around in that area. It is just so enjoyable to listen to them. Listen to everybody except our prime suspect, to listen to the way everybody expresses themselves.
Yeah.
It's just, to me, it's intoxicating.
Well, here's the thing about Ireland, okay? And I really, in some ways, just follow me for a second. I really think it's in very many ways offensive when Americans like to go to other countries because they think like people in another country are like adorable and awesome and like charming. The Irish completely deliver on all of those like disgusting American thoughts because they are awesome and charming, and the eloquence with which like every single person you talk to in Ireland speaks about their own life, their experiences, their country, their worldview. Ireland is a place, I mean, I've been there 3 times. I've never walked into a pub in Ireland or been in a situation at a festival or on a street or in a shop or in a bed and breakfast where I haven't felt like I could stay and talk to this person. And the Blarney Stone is real. It is a real thing. And there's a reason why it's an Irish legend, because the people in Ireland are great talkers. They are great talkers.
And I think it's important in this place, though, even though I find them very expressive, that we still understand that this place has a way of looking at outsiders.
Right.
And it sort of informs, when we get to the prime suspect, how they fit in with people who are there and with people who are also blow-ins.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of blow-ins there, though. I mean, he's not the only blow-in, which is super interesting. Now, I want to talk about some other thing that happens in the podcast and the production of the podcast that continually blew my mind throughout all 13 episodes. Now, I should say we got all 13 episodes. I listened to all 13 and it was like addictive. I could not stop. I had to hit play on the next one. I was like trying to find time. I was like at work, like in the bathroom, listening to 10 minutes of an episode, you know, that kind of thing. It's that kind of show. It really pulls you in.
Because it's audible, you know immediately, it's 8 hours.
Exactly. I've never heard any production that has such a wealth of found audio. The resources available to these podcasters. Laura, we have cops who accidentally taped themselves in their own conversations.
Oh, yeah.
We have a main character who, for whatever reason, carried a recorder around with him even when he was alone and would just keep like an audio diary. So in addition to all of these in-depth interviews, when they talk about something happening, then they just play the tape. from the 90s. Isn't that incredible?
It's really crazy. When I was listening to the suspect talking about, having this tape and he had also recorded conversations, I was thinking, boy, they have different rules there about recording people, huh? Kinda wouldn't get away with that here. But it was really, I liked it being able to have that window into the time period where something actually happened. But the recordings of the police officers, without giving anything away, that's when I was like, holy shit, I can't believe what I am hearing. And it was right there on tape. So you can't really challenge that it happened. Yeah, it was great. And I think the access, overall in this entire podcast was tremendous. And I think that's what made it so compelling.
Yeah.
And it's not a spoiler to say that, because you should know that if this case hasn't been solved, that there were mistakes made in the investigation.
Right.
And so they go through that too, which is also, I think, the listener is going to kind of like to hear how the Irish handle things, how the remote, the guards.
Yep. In that one place.
In that place, and like things that could have been done differently.
Yep. No, I do want to just make an observation. I just want to see if you guys agree. We've criticized a lot of podcasts, and we've heard criticisms from our listeners about a lot of our reviews of podcasts. And there are themes that come up over and over again, which is that, this is one-sided, or didn't get deep enough into the domestic violence angle, or we didn't hear enough from the victim or the victim's family, or we didn't give the cops a chance to respond to allegations of misconduct, or the reporter got too close to the subject.
Or not close enough.
This podcast is long. It's 13 episodes. I wonder how intentional it was, or just how thorough they decided to be, because I feel like every single one of those boxes was checked, that every criticism that we've ever put out or that we've gotten in response to our criticisms of like they have every single one of those elements in this show. Right, Kevin?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think they struck a good balance on things. I mean, I just have a couple, like I've already listed them, just a couple of sort of quibbles, and it's sort of about pacing, which isn't necessarily bad. It's just different, and I think I caution everybody that listens to the first episode and goes, that was nice, but I don't know why the crime writers were so high on this. Stick with it, and you'll see.
Yeah, Toby, do you think that they did a good job addressing like all of those aspects of this kind of story that we hear again and again, or sometimes missing from these podcasts?
Yeah, I mean, it's like kaleidoscopic, I guess. It really does. When it was over, I didn't wonder why they hadn't done certain things.
Mm-hmm.
It just kind of felt like it was a pretty full picture.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think the domestic violence thing, is something that's sort of a commonality in a lot of sort of violent crime, is that I think there was a thing about the one thing that adult mass shooters
yep.
have is a history of domestic violence.
Yep.
So I think giving that the proper weight is important, which I think they did.
I like how they sometimes, you feel like they're brushing off something, in particular like the domestic violence stuff, but it's only because they're focusing on something else, and then they come back to it.
They don't let it go.
In a very thorough way.
Right.
It's almost like, oh yeah, I forgot all about it.
I think they do the same thing with his potential innocence or guilt. I mean, I think that they are very thorough and sort of exploring the reasons on both sides. Laura, do you agree on the thoroughness angle? Do you think that they were just complete and thorough in this podcast?
Very thorough, which is why I still have 2 episodes to go, because I was trying to figure out when to fit this in. And I think that, at times, yes, that can feel like the pacing is different than we're used to, but at the same time, it's covering all the angles and asking, pretty much all the questions that you would want asked.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to tip our hands and tell our listeners whether or not they should check out West Cork. Listen to the 13 episodes if you'd like. That's how you can find it. And let's just give our review. Should our listeners do that? Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you. Thumbs up or thumbs down on West Cork?
I'm going to say thumbs up. Surprise, surprise. This was great. I really enjoyed it. I loved the place. I loved the characters. There's some really quirky characters and quirky behavior that come out as this podcast goes forward, which is something I always love. I was reminded of my new obsession, thanks to Rebecca Louise Penny, because it's similar. It's like this little village where everybody knows everybody, and things like that don't happen here, and yet it did. And so it's got that same sort of feel
to it that I've come to like in that style of mystery novel, but in a real life story.
Toby, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down on West Cork?
I definitely give it a thumbs up, and I would go a little further and just say that I think it raises the bar a little bit. If I was to list like my 4 or 5 favorite podcasts that I've listened to, I think this would probably be in it.
Wow, that's a hearty recommendation. And you know what? I'm actually going to agree with you. I think West Cork is excellent. I think it is different from shows like In the Dark or Accused or Serial, other excellent true crime podcasts we've talked about. It's produced a little bit differently. It's even mixed a little bit differently. And I know that a couple of weeks ago, I gave Atlanta Monster a lot of crap for the way that it mixed music with, especially electronic music, with talking. This podcast has electronic music and uses it well. And if you want to hear what a mix is supposed to sound like, technically speaking, listen to West Cork.
It's not indiscriminate trip hop.
It's not indiscriminate trip hop, and it's not arbitrary. But the story is thorough. My only slight critique is I do think, just on an editorial side, it could have benefited from some slight trimming, although I completely understand why they didn't, especially when you get in the later episodes, because the stuff they didn't trim comes into play later. There may have been ways to speed some of that stuff up. I don't know. It doesn't really matter because overall, I think it's just absolutely excellent. Huge thumbs up for me on West Cork. What about you, Kevin?
Well, I can see where the story ends up because it's still essentially a story that's going. Why we heard this hyped up by Eric Newsom over the summer at Podcast Movement, and why we were expecting to hear West Cork sooner. I think they just, it just keeps going on. It keeps being added.
Yes, but our listeners should not look it up. Don't look up the case.
Don't look up the case.
Don't do it.
Don't look up the case. And I have to apologize to my listeners for not thinking ahead to put West Cork with the Martha Stewart Wine Company. That would have been a hell of a transition. I think I blew it.
So what are you going to transition to now instead?
Well, I'm going to first say that thumbs up. For me, I think that it's the best podcast of 2018 so far. I know it's a small sample size, but I think that this is really good. Not the best of all time, but it's an excellent podcast.
It's up there. It's definitely the top 10 list, wouldn't you say?
Definitely a top 10 list. And it's sort of like Toby's right. It makes the West of Ireland sound awesome.
Do you ever meet someone who seems kind of off? Whether it's a creepy neighbor or random phone number that keeps calling you, Truthfinder has you covered. You can search for people by name, address, phone number, email, and more. Truthfinder can be especially helpful for running confidential background checks on anyone you're planning to meet from online dating apps. Go to truthfinder.com/podcasts for a special offer. That's truthfinder.com/podcasts to access your special offer today.
The friendship is sharing deal.
Because I want one of your McNuggets.
And I need some of your Quarter Pounder.
There's a deal for everyone at McDonald's. Get one favorite 10-piece chicken McNuggets, a Quarter Pounder, or a Big Mac, and get another for just $1. Price and participation may vary. Valid for item of equal or lesser value.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.
Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime of the week. Police in Worcestershire, UK, are working a kidnapping case that's taken them down a rabbit hole. Authorities say the world's largest rabbit was taken from his enclosure this week. Darius is a 4-foot-long continental giant rabbit recognized by Guinness as the largest of his kind. Investigators do believe he was taken and that it's not a case of this behemoth bunny just getting out of its enclosure. Unfortunately, because of COVID restrictions, Lara Bricker, pet detective, cannot get a work visa into the United Kingdom.
No.
So the Brits have to go it alone.
Good luck, Brits.
Even with the threat of legal action, the owners are offering a reward of 1,000 quid for Darius. You could call that more carrot, less stick. So the real question isn't who would take Darius, it's how did he get to be 4 feet long? Panel, how did this rabbit get so big? Lara Bricker, what do you think?
Well, Kevin thought I was just going to give an easy answer. But in fact, I went down the rabbit hole because I really wanted to know why is this rabbit so freaking big? Well, it turns out it's a special breed, the continental giant breed. And he is the fourth rabbit that this lady has owned that has held this title. Now, they're the longest. They don't call them the fattest because they don't want to, be mean to the rabbits. But
no body shaming.
So prior to this, Darius's mother, Alice, was the biggest rabbit. And prior to that, Amy. And Amy died in 2008 on a publicity tour in Italy.
Oh,
publicity tour?
Oh, no, it's crazy. I spent all afternoon watching videos about this. And then before that, it was Roberto. And
this was your whole afternoon.
Yeah, because
that too is crazy.
I wanted to know about this rabbit. So there was a story back in 2010, which is when the rabbit got this title, and it actually included what he really eats. So she said, Darius is very healthy. He has lots of exercise and a very good balanced diet. Now that includes every day he eats 1 bowl of rabbit chow, 2 apples, a dozen carrots with their leafy tops, and half a cabbage.
So he's like the Michael Phelps of rabbits.
Yeah.
That's very specific and accurate, Laura. But Toby Ball, how do you think this rabbit got so big?
Soylent Green is rabbits.
What do you think, Kevin?
Rick Moranis.
Oh, my God. What do you mean?
Honey, I blew up the rabbit.
All I can think about is, this is really, I do not believe in eating rabbits. I would never eat a rabbit, but I was looking up all these rabbit recipes and thinking about like, Darius would make so much of
rabbit
this,
cacciatore,
rabbit and wine and garlic sauce. Listen, I would never eat Darius. All I can think of is that is a big ass.
You want to be able to finish Darius.
4 feet. That's
nobody's going to say continental breakfast.
That's like an Irish wolfhound size.
It's huge.
Rabbit.
Oh, and there's one more fact. There's one more fact I didn't tell you. This is the creepiest thing that we actually should be talking about. His owner had surgery to make herself look like Jessica Rabbit in that.
Boy.
No, like legit.
What?
Oh, it's a whole thing. I need to go to England, people. I need to go to England.
That needs to be in our newsletter,
What?
Kevin.
All right, I'm doing this right now.
Yeah.
All right. We should probably end it on that note. Before we do, Laura Bricker, do we have a cat of the week this week?
We have a cat and a dog. They came to us from Aaron Byrne. And Erin sent us a lovely email about Butters, a 9-year-old Carolina dog.
Butters!
AKA American Dingo. And she says, my mom died suddenly 10 years ago and I became very depressed. One day I went to the pound to get a cat, but then a person I knew there explained that this tiny 6-week-old puppy had been left in a box on the side of the road. She was too little to adopt, but I fostered her and fell in love. We both missed our moms, but we had each other. She rescued me as much as I rescued her.
Oh,
and
Butters.
I love Butters. There's a picture of Butters running around. She was always by my side when I was caregiver to my father who has Alzheimer's. She is my best pal. So last summer, Butters was a little confused when Erin came home with a 5-week-old kitten. It gets better. Her fiance was fishing on the river, and when heading to a landing to pick her up, some friends, they passed her under a bridge, heard a cat meowing. They stopped and found this tiny kitty clinging to a bridge piling. So somebody, they think, threw him off the bridge like in the old days when they used to drown kittens in sacks. So they brought him home, and now he's theirs, and he's called Kitty Rogers. And so Butters and Kitty Rogers are our pets of the week this week.
Nice. I just got to say that Butters' owner, has to be a South Park fan, right? Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So Laura Bricker, folks want to reach out to you and pitch their heartwarming stories for their animals. It could be any kind of animal to be cat of the week. It also doesn't have to be that heartwarming. How can they find you online?
At Laura Bricker on Twitter.
And Toby Ball, folks want to reach out to you and tell you exactly what was up with that triangle-shaped flashing UFO that the U.S. military says is a legit UFO. How can they find you on Twitter?
Does the U.S. military seriously say that?
Right, they did. That was part of the story we saw this morning.
Well, what did they say?
It's a UFO. All it means is unidentified.
They said that it's, I don't know.
A UFO just means unidentified. It doesn't mean it's
whatever.
From space,
you can just get in touch with me at TobyBallNH with whatever your take is.
And Kevin Flynn, if folks want to reach out to you and say you are so lucky to be married to Rebecca Lavoie, how can they find you on Twitter?
I will not be accepting messages like that. You will be blocked at Kevin P. Flynn.
If you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, because I am, in fact, very lucky to be married to Kevin. See, I'm better than him. You can find me at Ramble Lavoie. You can also follow the show on Twitter at Crime Writers On, and I encourage you to join our amazing community and our official Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. We also have a regular old Facebook page, but, that's just an entree to the group. Join the group. Support the show at patreon.com/Partners in Crime Media. You'll get 4 extra podcasts. The Crime Writers On After Show, Married with Podcast, Toby Ball's Deep Dive Book Club podcast, and Laura Bricker's Leave It to Bricker podcast. And yes, sign up for our newsletter at crimewriterson.com. Our theme song was composed and performed by the wonderfully talented Ty Gibbons. Our line editor is the very handsome and very wonderfully talented Olivia Burdett. The executive producer of this fine program is Kevin Flynn. This show was recorded in the Yoga Loft above the Bodega in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi studio, otherwise known as Studio C, the closet in our New Hampshire basement where we've hung our copy of Christ on the Sea of Galilee. Shh, don't tell anybody. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for listening. We will catch you later.
Back in Boston, we have these gritty, seasoned Boston Globe reporters that have been doing this forever. The one, Shelley Murphy, who's covered organized crime forever, it seems like.
Dorchester, Mattapan, Saugus, Methuen,
Worcester,
Reading.
But then we have up at Revere Beach,
Lowell.
Kevin.
Chelmsford,
Taco
Revere.
Bell at Revere Beach. Yeah.
Salisbury.
Oh, my God.
I'm sorry, Kevin just doing the impressions of people in his and his ex-in-laws' families from all these towns. There are
Tewksbury.
Oh, no. Well,
Paulus. Sorry.
Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, okay. So anyway. Oh, my God.
Littleton.
Southie.
Partners in Crime Media.
Luxury is meant to be livable. Discover the new leather collection at Ashley with premium quality leather sofas, recliners, and more, all built to last. No matter how many spills, scuffs, or pet-related mishaps come its way, the leather collection at Ashley is made with the durability you need for the whole family. Shop the new leather collection at Ashley and find chairs starting at $499.99 and sofas at $599.99. Ashley, for the love of home.